Hello, everyone. We're starting our unit on JavaScript, and in doing this kind of module on JavaScript, we're not really doing a deep dive into JavaScript. So, in kind of examining this, we're going to kind of look at JavaScript just a little bit differently than we look at a lot of the other stuff that we've been looking at, and a lot of the other stuff that we've been looking at, we've been doing a lot of really deep dives into the material and making sure that we really understand the markup and how everything works and all that sort of stuff. But really, JavaScript is a class unto itself. And when you get to the next level class is going to be really JavaScript intensive. So in this class, we're kind of just doing a primer in JavaScript that is just kind of going along with the HTML and CSS markup that we're doing. So in these videos, what we're doing more of here is demonstration instead of really explaining the nuances of how all of this works. So when you get to the next level class, we'll do more of a deep dive into the nuances of all of the different programming stuff. And for those of you who have taken other programming classes before, or who have done other programming in other languages before, a lot of this will make sense to you. But for those of you who haven't, this might seem like a foreign language to you. So there is that. So I've got my code pen up here. And in this code pen, I want to create a little simple website. And I want to have a nice, fancy background for this website. I want to have a background that has a bunch of circles in it. But I want to use this background rendered solely in the browser. I don't want to make an image for this background. And I also want this background to be dynamic. So I want every time the page is loaded, I want every single piece of this background to be a different color. So what I want to do is I want to make a bunch of circles on my background. And then I want to make every circle a random color. So the first thing that we need to do is we really need to lay the foundation for what we're going to need for our JavaScript a little later on. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by adding a couple tags to our HTML. And I'm actually going to go ahead and resize my HTML and CSS pane so we can have a larger JavaScript pane, because most of our work here is going to be done in our JavaScript pane. So I'm going to add a body tag into my HTML pane. And normally when we work in CodePen, we don't have to add the body tag. But since we're going to be working with some JavaScript this time, and we want to load a certain function at a certain time, we're going to add the body tag here so we can load the function on the body load. And we're going to add a main tag and give it an ID selector of container. And this will be the container for our background. And that's the only HTML that we're going to write for the time being. Now, the first thing that I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to write a function that's going to make all of my elements in my background. So I'm going to simplify this for myself just a little bit by writing a little bit of CSS. So I know I'm going to make these elements using div tags. So I'm going to add a div element selector into my CSS. And I'm going to add a little bit of CSS to this to just kind of represent what I want this to be. Width is going to be 60 pixels. Height is going to be 60 pixels. And border radius, which we've looked at previously, is going to be 50%. So what that's going to do is that's going to give me a circle. And for the time being, for testing purposes, I'm going to set a background color to just be green. So now if I come into my main HTML element here and create a div, we should see this little circle pop up in our web page. And that's good. That's what we want. We want a little circle. But we don't want just one little circle. We want to fill up our entire page with circles. So we could make a whole bunch of div tags in here by hand, right? But we don't have to do that. We can use JavaScript to that end. So let's make a function in JavaScript. So in order to do that, we're going to use our function keyword. And then we get to name our function. I'm going to name this function circles. You can basically name your function whatever you want. We want to avoid JavaScript keywords. And we can't really start it. We don't want to start it with a number. We want to start it with a letter. We want to keep symbols out of the names except for the underscore. And we want to avoid any kind of other keywords. So if you can just make it a sort of generalized word that doesn't really appear anywhere else in JavaScript, you're going to be fine. So we're going to call this circles. And then we put our opening and closing parentheses afterwards. And this is where we would, in certain cases, put arguments. And in this case, we don't need any arguments. But in other cases, we might need arguments. And we're not really going to look at arguments in the scope of this class, but we will probably look at them in a later class. And then to encapsulate our function, we're going to add braces or curly brackets, whatever you want to call them. So whatever code that we want to write for our function is going to go between these braces or curly brackets. So whatever kind of code we write is going to be encapsulated by these curly braces. And all of that code that we write in between here belongs to this function. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a couple of variables. And variables are essentially a container. We can create this container and we can put different kinds of data in this container. And then when we refer to this container later on, we're referring to the data that is inside the container. Essentially what we're doing is we're creating a symbolic link between the name of the container and the data that's inside it. This allows us to manipulate that data and change that data so that we can utilize it for different purposes. In this case, we're going to be able to utilize this to change the X position and the Y position of our elements. So let's discuss that for just a moment. So when we create a circle, you saw before that when we create this circle, it just kind of sat in one place. And if we just created a bunch of circles without changing their positions, they would just kind of all stack on top of each other. You know, we've kind of talked before that that's how HTML works. But we really don't want to do that. We want to be able to kind of define the positions of our elements. So we're going to want to be able to change the positions based on where our element is. So what we're going to do is we're going to set a variable of xPOS, or x position. And for right now, we're going to set that to 0. And we're going to set a variable of yPOS, or y position. And we're going to set that to 0. And now this is pretty critical, and I'm going to go ahead and zoom in so you can all see this just a little bit better. One of the things that we've discussed before is that you probably think your computer is pretty smart. Like your computer should know what you mean. But your computer is actually really dumb, right? Your computer only knows what you tell it. So you have to be really specific with the way you format things, the way you put in your commands, the way you write your code. So when we write this code and we declare these variables, we have to declare them in this sort of format. Now, with JavaScript, we can declare a variable in several ways. For our purposes right now, we're only going to be using the var keyword as the preface for our variable, but there are different ways that we can declare a variable and utilize a variable. So now we have these two variable containers that we've established, xPOS or xPOS and yPOS or yPOS, and they both have the value of 0 sitting in them. But we're going to do something with them a little bit later on in order to change that value. So now what we need to do is we need to add what we call loops. And loops execute a sequence of code over and over and over again. So we need to add one loop for the number of rows and one loop for the number of circles on said row. So the first loop is actually going to be for the number of rows. So we're going to write a loop for var I equals 0. I is less than or equal to, for the time being, we'll say 10. We'll change that number in a little bit after you see all this, how all this works. And then I plus plus. So what this here is essentially saying is that when we start this loop, I is going to be equal to 0. So we're going to have this variable that is going to be equal to 0. And as long as I is less than or equal to 10, we're going to execute the code that is going to fall between these curly braces that we've just established in there. Now, after each time we go through this code that we're going to put between these curly braces, we're going to add 1 to the value of I. That's what that I plus plus means. That's shorthand for adding 1 to the value of I. So the first time we run the code, I will be equal to 0. The second time we run the code, I will be equal to 1. The third time we run the code, I will be equal to 2. Once I is equal to 11, it'll stop running the code. So this will get us the number of rows that we want for our primary demonstration. So now let's do something similar to get the number of individual circles that we want. So we'll want to add another for loop for var j equals 0. J is less than or equal to 10. J plus plus. And we'll add our curly braces. So now each time that it runs through that I for loop, it's going to run this J for loop. So it's going to run this J for loop through its paces 10 times. So it's going to create these circles. Technically it's 11 times because we're starting at 0 and going through 10. So it's going to create these circles that we're going to create with some JavaScript here in just a moment. So what we have to do in order to be able to create this circle is we have to find where we want to put the circle. And we do that using our HTML DOM elements. So we have this HTML element here that we've given an ID of container. It's inside of this container that we want to put this circle. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to be able to find container. So we'll have to get it. So document is representative of the entire website. Get element by ID. ID being that ID selector that we put in there. So since we're using get element by ID, we can add in between parentheses container. And then we're going to add some inner HTML. So .inner HTML to that container. Now what we want to do is we want to add some new inner HTML to this container every time we go through this loop. Now we could just press equals here and add what we want to add. But what that will do is it will replace the HTML every time. So since we want to add new HTML every time, we need to use plus equals. So using plus equals will add a new instance of the HTML that we're about to reference every single time. And so we'll put this in between double quotes. And we use double quotes to differentiate between some of the things that we'll need to put in single quotes. So we can separate double quotes and single quotes in our code here. So our double quotes can be for our JavaScript and our single quotes can be for our HTML. And this is also where we're going to have to employ some of the variables that we declared earlier, our X position and our Y position. So try to stay with me on this, because this can get a little confusing. So we're going to be adding these divs. So it's going to be div. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to start writing HTML here, because this is inner HTML. It's going to be HTML that we're going to insert inside of our main tag. So we're going to write inline CSS styling here to make this a little bit easier. So style equals, and in our HTML, if we wrote inline styling, we would use quotes to wrap our styling. We're using double quotes to wrap our JavaScript here, so we need to use single quotes to wrap our HTML styling. So we use a single quote, and we'll delete the second single quote. We'll bring it back in later. So we're going to add the position of fixed. That'll become important later because I'm going to want to put a layer on top of this. We're going to put a left position on this of. Now we're going to come outside of this plus sign, or we're going to come outside of this double quote. We're going to add a plus sign, and then we're going to add our variable name for X position, XPOS. Then we're going to add another plus sign and another set of double quotes. What we've done here is called concatenation. That's where we take a string of text and bring it together with a variable that we're using in our JavaScript. So when this is all said and done, when it puts it into our HTML, it's going to take whatever data value is inside of that container at that particular point in time and put it in that position in our HTML. So then we just keep writing our HTML styling. So pixels, top, colon, space, and then we're going to want to concatenate that with our Y position. Just like we did with our pixels, just like we did with our X position there. We'll add our semicolon. We'll add our other single quote that we meant to add earlier, and we'll delete the other single quote that CodePen adds by default. We'll throw that. We'll add a non-breaking space in here. We'll close our div tag. Now, the only thing that we have to do now is we have to iterate the positions. So through each iteration, we're going to add 70 to the X position. So XPOS plus equals 70. And then, for every row position, we want to reset our X position. So XPOS equals 0. And we're going to add 70 to our Y position. Plus equals 70. So now let's zoom out of this. Let's save. And the only other thing that we have to do here is we have to add a reference to this function in our HTML. So in order to do that, we will add into our body tag the onload attribute. We'll set onload equal to the name of our function, which is circles. We'll do that and we'll save. And then we see I accidentally wrote XPOS twice there instead of XPOS and YPOS. So once I fix that, we see our grid of circles appear on our screen. So right now they're all green because we set the background color to green in our div CSS here. They're all conforming to this div CSS just like we want them to, which is great. In order to change the number of circles that we get, all we'd have to do is change the numbers that are in our for loops. So remember, the first one is for the number of rows. The second one is for essentially the number of columns. So if we wanted more circles in our columns, we take that second number, we can change it to 20 and save. And all of a sudden, we get more circles going across. It looks like maybe around 26 or so will fill up the width of my monitor here. We'll make it 27 just to have it nice and full. There we go. So now we're going all the way across. And that's looking pretty cool. And if we pop the screen out onto a new screen, you can see how high it goes down. You can see that we probably, if we wanted to fill this up for this particular example, we can go, about 4 or 5 more here. So let's get back into the edit. We'll add about 6 more into there. You can add as many as you want here. When you add a whole lot, especially with CodePen here, it starts to kind of bog down the system. But the next thing that we want to do is we're going to want to make all of these the random colors that we talked about. So in order to do that, we're going to have to kind of remember back to when we talked about colors in our CSS. Right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and remove this background color from div here. I'm just going to take this out because we're not going to need it for much longer. And we're going to go back into our JavaScript. So let's zoom in here so we can get a better look. So I'm going to want it to change for every circle. So I'm going to want to put my code to generate random colors in my code for my circle generation, which is my second loop here. So I'm going to want to create 3 variables in this loop. And we're going to call them variable R, variable G, and variable B for red, green, and blue. And we're going to set them equal to a little random number function. So we'll use math.floor, math.random times 255. And we'll do that for all of these. So I'll just take that and copy it and paste it into all of these places. And what that's going to do is that's just going to give me a random number that I can kind of put in these places. Now, math.random gives me essentially a random number between 0 and 1 in JavaScript. Then I'm going to multiply that random number by 255. So the highest number I can get is 255. The lowest number I can get is 0, which is, the number range that we get for our RGB color values. And then math.floor rounds it down. So if there's any kind of funky decimal points after our number after it's multiplied, it's going to round it down to an even number. So now that I have that, all I need to do is come into my CSS of my inline styled image, add my background color property, and we're going to have to do some more stuff with concatenation here. So we're going to do this with the RGB formatting. So RGB and we're going to add a single quote, or double quote rather, so that we can concatenate our value of R. And then we're going to need some double quotes to add a comma and a space. Then we can kind of take this whole thing, copy it, paste it. This is somewhere where you have to kind of pay attention because this can get kind of confusing. G. And we can add some spaces in here because it'll kind of help us out. And finally, we can concatenate the value of B. Add our final double quote. Close the parenthesis. And we're good to go from there. So now we have random numbers going into some RGB color values here. So what we want to do is we want to kind of look this over just to make sure that everything's correct, right? Because it can actually kind of be, this can kind of be really tricky. Let me zoom back out here. And there we go. We have all of our random colors. So we just want to make sure that we have all of that formatting proper. And I'm going to zoom into that again just to make sure that you've got it on the same page. You got to kind of pay extra attention, so there might be some, because it gets kind of confusing when you're doing all of this with all of the additional concatenation with all of these extra variables, right? But that gives us this. So we'll just kind of leave this here for just a second. You can kind of refresh or pause the video and make sure that your code is up to speed if you're following along. So pause. This is a good place to pause right here to make sure that you're up to speed with this function. And now we have all of these randomly colored circles. In our background. And if we pop this page out, we can see a whole page worth of randomly colored circles. And if we refresh the page using F5, you can see that each time we refresh the page, the circles are a different color. So they're dynamic. They're randomly colored every single time, which is pretty cool. So let's do one more thing, because I kind of want to make this a finished looking web page. I want to add a content block in the middle here. So what I want to do is I'm going to come into my HTML and I'm going to add just a section tag with the class of con. Because I want this to be a finished looking website. So since we made these circles since we made them fixed elements, they're not going to go anywhere. They're going to be fixed on the page. So even when we have something else that's going to be on the page, our background elements won't be scrolling. Our circles won't be scrolling. They'll be fixed. They'll be static on the page. And other things that we put on the page can be scrolling. So I can take this container element. I can add it into my CSS. So I'll use the con class selector here. Give it position relative. Give it a width of, we'll say, 960 pixels. We'll give it a height of 1200 pixels. We'll give it a z-index, just to make sure that it's on top, of 2. And we'll give it a background color of white. And we'll give it a margin of 0 auto, just to center it up. And now, all of a sudden, we have this pretty cool website with this background here. So even if we started to put text in it, let's say, let's put a font family here, font family, sans serif, and let's just add some text. I'll open a lorem ipsum generator in another browser. We'll just get a lorem ipsum generator here in another browser. so that we can throw some text in here. Add some paragraph tags around it. We can also add some stuff that we've talked about before, like box sizing, border box, add some padding. We'll say 24 pixels. We'll change our font size. Make it 2M. We'll add a header. And now all of a sudden we have this cool website example that has a dynamic background of circles that change color every time we refresh the page, thanks to our JavaScript. I forgot to save. So let's save here so we can go to this view. F11 it. And then we can refresh this a few times just to watch the circles change color in the background. And so as your guests visit your website, each guest will have a unique experience, because they will all see different colored circles in the background of your website. And that's pretty cool. So that's all that I have for this video. Thank you for watching.